The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. A dozen executives sat around the polished mahogany table, their designer watches glinting under the recessed lights. On the wall, a massive screen displayed quarterly revenue figures, except for one red column, a glaring anomaly among the green. All eyes turned toward her. "Explain this, Miss Harris," said Victor Lang, the company's chief financial officer, his voice smooth but laced with disdain. "Unless you're admitting you don't understand the numbers you're responsible for." The words landed like a slap. Evelyn Harris, the only black woman in the entire leadership team of Halbert & Co., straightened in her seat. She had been the director of strategic development for 3 years, yet she knew exactly what this was. Not an inquiry, but a performance. A public shaming. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, not curious, not neutral, but measuring, waiting for her to falter. "I do understand them," she replied, her voice steady despite the quickening in her chest. "The decline in Q2 is linked to the supply chain disruptions we flagged in April. You all received my report?" "Ah," Victor interrupted, leaning back with a theatrical sigh. "The famous report. The one you sent without consulting my office. A report, mind you, that projected disaster. And here we are, disaster realized." Several executives chuckled, the sound low and complicit. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She could feel the subtle shift, the way the conversation had been framed to make her the root of the problem, despite the fact that the data and the warnings had been dismissed months ago. It wasn't just about the figures. It was about power and who was allowed to wield it. "I sent that report because the suppliers in West Africa were facing political instability," she said firmly. "If we had diversified our sourcing," Victor raised a hand, palm outward, as though silencing a child. "Enough. You've made your point." She wanted to speak again, but she could feel the invisible wall that hung between her and the rest of them. To push harder here would only cement the image they were trying to craft of her emotional, combative, out of line. So she sat back, breathing slowly, but she saw it, the smirk curling at the corner of Victor's mouth. He thought he had won. The meeting ended with polite handshakes among the others, papers shuffled, chairs scraping. Evelyn stayed seated until they began to file out. As she rose to leave, Victor leaned close enough for only her to hear. "You'll find that this company rewards loyalty, Miss Harris," he said softly, his cologne sharp and expensive. "And it punishes other things." It wasn't a threat in the legal sense. It was worse. It was the kind of warning that carried the weight of precedent, the unspoken knowledge that others before her had been silenced, sidelined, erased. That afternoon, she returned to her office on the 27th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but it felt less like a privilege than a glass box. She sat down and pulled up the archived emails, the ones from April, detailing the supply chain concerns. Her name, her timestamp, the data she had gathered, all of it ignored. She had proof, but in a place like this, proof wasn't enough. The system didn't collapse because of truth. It collapsed only when truth was weaponized. She thought of the younger analysts she mentored, especially Maya, who had joined the company 6 months ago. Bright, ambitious, and already facing the subtle barriers Evelyn knew too well being talked over in meetings. Having ideas attributed to someone else, being told to be patient, as promotions went to less qualified men. Evelyn had fought to open a door for herself, but she had no illusions. That door could slam shut at any moment. 2 days later, the sabotage became explicit. A memo circulated through the leadership team authored by Victor, but with the CEO's signature announcing structural realignments within the Strategic Development Department. Evelyn's role would be temporarily reassigned, pending an internal review of the Q2 results. In practical terms, she was being stripped of authority. No explanation to the staff, No acknowledgement of her prior warnings. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the city lights flickering through the window, sifting through her files. She remembered the advice her grandmother had given her when she first started her career. If you're going to challenge them, child, you better have a story they can't rewrite. By morning, she had a plan. She began compiling a dossier, not just on the supply chain issue, but on every pattern she had observed in her years at Halbert & Co. Contracts awarded to cronies, despite lower bids. Departments gutted after whistleblowers spoke up. Minority hires paraded for diversity reports, but locked out of real decision-making. It was all there, buried in public records, meeting minutes, and forgotten attachments. But information alone wouldn't change anything. She needed the right moment. And in companies like this, moments were manufactured at shareholder meetings. 3 weeks later, Evelyn walked into the grand ballroom of the Marriott downtown. The annual meeting was a performance of wealth and stability. Champagne glasses clinking, tailored suits, soft jazz drifting from a corner stage. The shareholders expected reassurance. The executives expected control. And Evelyn expected resistance. She wore a navy suit, understated but sharp. Around her neck was a simple pendant, a gift from her grandmother, which she touched once, briefly, as though grounding herself. The meeting began with the CEO delivering a glowing overview, skipping neatly over Q2's losses. Victor followed with a presentation full of upward trending graphs and projections that would soothe the most skeptical investor. Then came the open floor session, when shareholders could ask questions. It was a ritual most executives found tedious. Today, it would be their undoing. When Evelyn stood, the microphone in her hand, the room quieted. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who had been underestimated for too long. "I have a question," she began, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "For the leadership team, and for the shareholders who deserve transparency." In April, a report was submitted warning of specific supply chain risks in West Africa. That report was ignored. As a result, the company lost millions in Q2. My question is simple. Why was the warning dismissed? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The CEO shifted in his seat. Victor's smile tightened. Before they could answer, she continued. "And while we're discussing transparency, why is it that minority suppliers account for less than 2% of our contracts? Despite public commitments to equity? Why have 3 whistleblowers left the company in the past 2 years following performance reviews? Why are diversity statistics used for marketing while decision-making remains concentrated in the same narrow demographic?" The room was no longer quiet, it was electric. Investors exchanged looks. Cameras, usually an afterthought at these meetings, began to focus. Evelyn reached into her bag and withdrew a slim folder. "I have documented evidence of these patterns, emailed warnings, meeting minutes, contract records, all of it verified. I am submitting copies to the Independent Audit Committee today." Victor leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ms. Harris, this is neither the time nor the place. This is exactly the time and place," she said, cutting him off. "Because this is where accountability lives or dies." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a shareholder, an older woman in a pearl necklace, stood up and addressed the board. "I move that we call for an independent investigation." And just like that, the tide shifted. The motion hung in the air like a match just struck, its flame small but alive. Several shareholders nodded, murmuring among themselves. A man in a gray suit, one of the company's oldest investors, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, something that made them both look sharply at the CEO. The CEO cleared his throat, forcing a polite smile. "We can certainly consider an audit," he said, his tone measured. "However, we must remember that sudden changes can destabilize investor confidence. We will, of course, handle any internal matters appropriately." Evelyn heard the code in his words. We will bury this quietly. It was the same tactic she'd seen 100 times. Acknowledge just enough to appear responsive, then let the truth die in committee. But this time, she had come prepared for more than polite deflection. Before the CEO could move on, she raised her voice again. With respect, investor confidence depends on trust. And trust cannot exist without transparency. This is not a personal grievance. It's a systemic issue. You can either address it in the open or explain to the press why you refuse to. The shift in the room was palpable. Phones began to appear, discreetly recording. Some shareholders looked uncomfortable, others curious, but no one was dismissing her now. Victor sat back in his chair, eyes narrowed, calculating. An older man near the front raised his hand. I second the motion for an independent investigation. The bylaws were clear. A motion seconded by 2 shareholders during the open floor session required a vote. The CEO hesitated, scanning the room, but the legal counsel at his side gave a small nod. There was no avoiding it. All in favor? Hands rose first a few, then more, until the majority of the room had committed. Evelyn didn't allow herself to smile. She knew the vote was just the opening move. Investigations could be delayed, watered down, redirected. The real fight was still ahead. The meeting adjourned earlier than planned, tension replacing the usual air of champagne-fueled satisfaction. Evelyn walked out into the hotel lobby with her head high, aware of eyes following her, some with admiration, others with hostility. She didn't care. She had cracked the facade. The following week, the retaliation began in earnest. Her calendar invites disappeared. Her access to certain financial databases was temporarily restricted due to system upgrades. Her name was omitted from a key strategy memo. Colleagues who had once been cordial now avoided her in the hallway. She recognized the pattern. It was the slow, deliberate suffocation of relevance. They wanted her isolated, frustrated, and eventually gone. But Evelyn had already decided she wasn't going quietly. She met Maya for coffee in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office. The young analyst arrived looking anxious, glancing around before sliding into the seat opposite Evelyn. I heard they're reassigning your projects, Maya said in a low voice. They are, Evelyn replied. It's meant to send a message. Maya hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from her bag. I think you should see this. I copied the original vendor approval forms from last year, the ones for that West African supplier you warned about. The dates don't match the official records. Someone changed them after the fact. Evelyn took the drive carefully, feeling the weight of it in her palm. This was more than proof of negligence. It was proof of deliberate falsification. The kind of evidence that could turn a quiet internal review into a public scandal. Why give this to me? Evelyn asked, though she already suspected the answer. Because I've seen what happens here, Maya said. I don't want to spend my career keeping quiet while they bury people like you and like me. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then we'll make sure this isn't buried. Over the next 2 weeks, she built her case in silence. She worked late in her office with the lights low, combing through financial records, email threads, and procurement logs. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Inflated contracts for connected vendors, falsified performance metrics, and deliberate suppression of internal warnings. She compiled everything into a secure cloud folder, with multiple backups hidden in encrypted drives. She also began reaching out quietly to journalists she trusted. Not the sensationalist kind, but those who understood systemic injustice and knew how to tell a story without letting it be reduced to gossip. It was risky. She knew she could lose her job, her reputation, even her ability to work in the industry again. But she thought of her grandmother's words, of the young women watching her, and of the corrosive truth that staying silent would make her complicit. The investigation, predictably, stalled. The audit committee requested additional time to review documents. Victor publicly framed the process as a routine procedural check. The CEO assured investors there was no evidence of intentional wrongdoing. That was when Evelyn decided to force their hand. She sent a single, carefully worded email to the board, copying the audit committee and the company's legal team. In it, she summarized her findings without disclosing sources, then stated plainly, "If the independent investigation is not concluded and its results made public within 30 days, I will release all relevant documentation to the press. This includes evidence of altered records, discriminatory procurement practices, and the suppression of internal safety and compliance warnings." There was no bluff in her words. She signed the email, closed her laptop, and exhaled slowly. The backlash was immediate. Legal called her in for a conversation. HR sent a memo reminding employees of confidentiality obligations. A colleague she barely knew warned her in the elevator, "They're going to come after you hard." Evelyn didn't flinch. She had spent her life navigating systems designed to make her doubt herself. This was simply the final, most visible battle. What she didn't expect was the quiet wave of support that followed. Anonymous envelopes slid under her office door with old meeting transcripts. An accountant she'd never spoken to before sent her a secure message with copies of questionable invoices. Even a mid-level manager from procurement asked to meet her off the record. The system was rotting from the inside, but that also meant cracks were appearing everywhere. On the 29th day, the board announced that the audit findings would be made public in a special shareholder meeting. They framed it as a commitment to transparency, but Evelyn knew the truth. They had been cornered. Still, she wasn't naive. She expected them to minimize, to blame isolated incidents and miscommunication. That's why she had arranged for something they couldn't spin. On the morning of the meeting, a major investigative news outlet published an in-depth expose complete with leaked documents, timelines, and testimonies from current and former employees. The article didn't just describe negligence. It revealed a culture of systemic bias, financial manipulation, and retaliation against those who spoke up. The story went live exactly 30 minutes before the shareholders gathered. Inside the meeting hall, the atmosphere was nothing like the usual corporate theater. There was no jazz, no small talk-only tense clusters of people reading the article on their phones. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters waiting. When the CEO tried to open the session, a shareholder interrupted him. "We've all read the article," she said sharply. "The only question now is what you intend to do about it." Victor shifted uncomfortably. The CEO began to stammer something about preliminary steps when Evelyn stood, the same calm in her voice as weeks before. "The question is not what they intend to do," she said, "but what they are required to do under the law and under their fiduciary duty to you, the shareholders. Every minute they stall is another minute of liability." This time, no one silenced her. The tension in the room was almost physical, pressing against every breath. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, cameras trained. The board members shifted in their seats, their rehearsed composure unraveling under the weight of scrutiny. One of the older shareholders, a man with decades of ties to the company, rose to his feet. His voice was calm, but his words landed like blows. "I've invested in Halbert & Co. for 32 years. I've tolerated the usual corporate politics, but I will not tolerate fraud. We demand resignations, immediate restructuring of procurement oversight, and legal review of the falsified records." The ripple that followed wasn't polite applause, it was momentum. Another shareholder stood, then another. They weren't all united in principle, but they understood the stakes. The scandal was already public. The faster they acted, the better chance they had of salvaging their investments. The CEO tried to regain control. "We understand the concerns, and we will be taking all necessary Necessary? Evelyn cut in, her tone sharp but measured. Necessary would have been acting when warnings were first raised. Necessary would have been preventing the losses, not scrambling after exposure. This is not leadership, it's damage control. A few in the audience nodded openly. Evelyn knew she was pushing the line, but she also knew that silence now would be surrender. By midday, the meeting dissolved into chaos. The press had their headlines. Board faces revolt amid fraud allegations. Stock prices began to dip before the market even closed. Evelyn left the building without lingering. She had no illusions that this was the end. In fact, she expected the days ahead to be worse threats, legal intimidation, perhaps even attempts to discredit her personally. But for the first time in weeks, she felt the ground tilt ever so slightly away from those who had always controlled it. That night, her apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. She sat at her kitchen table, phone buzzing with notifications, journalists requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering support, strangers thanking her for speaking out. But among the flood of messages was one that made her pause. "We've never met, but I used to work in compliance at Halbert. I was forced out after raising issues about falsified safety audits. I still have the files. If you're willing to keep fighting, I want to help." She stared at the message for a long time, feeling the strange mix of exhaustion and renewed resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore, if it ever truly had been. The next morning, she met the former compliance officer in a small park, away from office towers and familiar faces. He was in his 50s, weathered from years in corporate trenches, and carried a plain manila envelope. "These audits," he said, handing it to her, "show that the company ignored multiple safety violations at overseas facilities. If regulators see this, it won't just be an internal scandal, it'll be a legal one." Evelyn flipped through the documents, the pages dense with technical language but damning in implication. Violations marked resolved, with no evidence of action taken. Facilities deemed compliant despite repeated accidents. "This could force a full federal investigation," she said quietly. "That's the idea," he replied, "but it has to be airtight. If they find one hole, they'll say the whole thing is unreliable." Evelyn nodded. She already knew the journalists who could handle it, people who would verify every line before publishing. Meanwhile, inside Halbert & Co., the leadership scrambled to contain the crisis. Victor, once smug in his untouchable position, began avoiding the press entirely. Internal memos circulated urging employees to remain professional and avoid speculative discussions. The audit committee released a bland preliminary statement acknowledging administrative discrepancies, but denying any systemic wrongdoing. It was the kind of statement Evelyn had predicted, and the kind she had been ready to counter. 3 days later, the second wave hit. The investigative outlet published a follow-up piece, this time focused entirely on the falsified safety audits. The article named specific facilities, documented injuries, and quoted workers whose complaints had been buried. It also made clear that the audit committee had access to these records, but chose to ignore them. The fallout was immediate. Regulatory agencies announced formal inquiries. Advocacy groups called for boycotts. International suppliers began to suspend contracts, unwilling to be linked to a company now synonymous with corruption. For Evelyn, the days became a blur of media calls, legal consultations, and careful strategy sessions with allies. She knew that once systems like this started to crack, they could collapse unpredictably, sometimes in ways that left the original whistleblowers crushed beneath the rubble. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Maya continued to feed her relevant documents. The former compliance officer became a steady presence, connecting her with others who had been pushed out of Halbert over the years. Even some current employees, speaking anonymously, confirmed the patterns she had exposed. 2 weeks later, the board held an emergency meeting close to the press, but impossible to keep fully secret. Within hours, news leaked. The CEO was resigning, citing personal reasons. Victor Lang was placed on indefinite leave pending investigation. The company promised a new era of transparency and equity. Evelyn read the headlines without celebration. She'd seen rebrands before cosmetic changes meant to placate the public without altering the underlying culture. If this was going to mean anything, it couldn't stop at personnel changes. It had to rewrite the rules. She drafted a proposal bold, specific, and impossible to ignore. It called for independent oversight of procurement and compliance with public quarterly reports, a whistleblower protection program managed by an external body, mandatory diversity in decision-making roles with measurable goals and timelines, a transparent process for addressing supplier and employee grievances. When she sent it to the board, she didn't ask for credit. She simply wrote, "If you want to prove this company can change, start here." The board, still reeling from the public backlash, agreed to adopt most of the measures. Not out of moral awakening. Evelyn knew that, but because they had no other choice if they wanted to survive. The announcement was met with cautious optimism from the public and outright skepticism from those who had seen similar promises fade. Evelyn understood both reactions. Change was fragile. It required constant pressure, and she was ready to keep pressing. Weeks later, she stood outside the towering glass facade of Halbert & Co., the place where she had been silenced, sidelined, and underestimated. Inside, the machinery of corporate power was still turning, but it now had new checks, new eyes watching. As she walked away, her phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "They're scared of you. Keep going." Evelyn smiled faintly. It wasn't fear she wanted from them, it was accountability. And for the first time, she believed it might actually be possible. 3 months passed. Halbert & Co. was still standing, but it no longer moved with the quiet arrogance it once had. The executive floor was half empty. Some retired early, others had been removed discreetly. Legal battles were still ongoing. Investigations were still underway. But the board had been forced to make public commitments, and Evelyn had become a symbol they couldn't afford to ignore. She didn't return to her position. That part of her life sitting quietly in rooms that pretended to tolerate her was over. But she hadn't left the fight. She was now working as a consultant for independent watchdog groups, helping expose similar structures in other companies. And she was training others, especially women of color, on how to document abuse, gather evidence, and protect themselves from retaliation. Still, not everything was forward motion. The cost had been steep. Some of her former colleagues turned on her publicly, calling her vindictive, divisive, unprofessional. There were death threats, lawsuits, online harassment. But there were also quiet messages. A woman who worked in a regional bank sent her a long email explaining how she'd once been demoted after reporting a supervisor for sexual harassment. Another woman, working in tech, described the gutting loneliness of being the diversity hire and nothing more. They weren't asking Evelyn to fix anything, they just wanted to say, "You are right to speak. You helped me believe I could too." And then one day, her phone rang. The name on the screen made her freeze. It was the chairman of the board. She let it ring 4 times before answering. "Ms. Harris," he began, polite but distant, "I wanted to inform you that we've reached a settlement with federal regulators. There will be no criminal charges, but we are implementing every structural reform you proposed." "I saw the release," Evelyn said flatly. "That's why you're calling me?" "Partly. We'd like to ask if you'd consider returning on your terms. To lead the new Ethics and Compliance Division. Complete independence, full resources, direct line to the board." She didn't answer right away. She stood at her window, looking out at the rain tracing soft rivers down the glass. "Why me?" she asked finally. He hesitated. "Because you exposed us." "Because you were right. and because we've realized the cost of not listening. The words sounded sincere, or practiced. But sincerity didn't matter to her anymore. Only action. "I'll consider it," she said. "But I'm not coming back to fix your reputation. I'm coming to protect the people you've ignored for years. Understood?" She hung up and stood in silence. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight alone. The following month, Evelyn returned to the 27th floor, not as a subordinate, but as an independent force. Her new office had no glass walls, no performative views. It was smaller, quieter, intentional. She began by hiring her own team, people who had been pushed out of traditional spaces because they asked hard questions or refused to look away. Investigators, data analysts, policy writers, people who had learned not in boardrooms, but in the margins. She established a new protocol. Any employee, regardless of rank, could file an anonymous report. Her office would investigate without interference. Findings would be published quarterly, without edits. Some scoffed. Others resisted. But slowly, grudgingly, a new culture began to take root. Not perfect, not pure, but real. 6 months in, Evelyn attended her first leadership summit, not as a guest, but as a keynote speaker. The room was filled with executives from across industries, many of whom had watched her story unfold in the media. Her speech was quiet, controlled. "I'm not here to tell you how to look good," she said. "I'm here to tell you what happens when people you dismiss stop waiting for permission." She paused, scanning the room. No applause. Just silence, the kind that comes when truth is finally sharper than fear. "I know how systems protect themselves," she continued. "I know how they silence, reassign, and erase. But I also know what happens when people refuse to disappear. You can either choose to change willingly, or you can be forced to. But either way, the world is watching now." This time, when she finished, the applause was real, hesitant, uneven, but real. Later that night, she sat alone in her apartment, sipping tea by the window. The city pulsed below her, neon and soft noise. Her inbox was full again, questions, praise, more stories of injustice. But among them was one quiet message from Maya. "They offered me the promotion. First woman of color to lead my division. I accepted, but only because I knew I wouldn't be the last." Evelyn closed her eyes. A long exhale escaped her lungs. Victory wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came like this, quiet, steady, undeniable. Months passed, and Evelyn's presence at Halbert & Co. became both a signal and a shift. People began to speak more openly. Not loudly, this wasn't a revolution, but with a new kind of certainty. Meetings no longer echoed with unchecked arrogance. Department heads who had once rolled their eyes at ethics now paused before signing contracts. Hiring practices changed. Performance reviews included accountability, not just for results, but for impact. The resistance hadn't disappeared. Some just went underground smiling in meetings, sabotaging in silence. But Evelyn had expected that. Real change was never clean. It was slow, jagged, and met with denial at every turn. But it was moving. One afternoon, Evelyn walked through the lobby of the company. She wasn't wearing a badger. Clearance didn't require it anymore. But the new security guard greeted her by name. That hadn't happened before. A small thing, but she noticed. As she waited for the elevator, she saw a young woman standing at the edge of the atrium, holding a tablet and looking lost. She wore the discreet black uniform of contract staff, barely noticed by most, but never by Evelyn. "You look like someone's giving you the runaround," Evelyn said gently. The woman turned, startled. "I'm trying to deliver these prototypes to the R&D floor, but no one gave me clearance." "Come with me," Evelyn said. She took the woman up herself, passed her through the new security protocols, and made sure the delivery was logged and signed. It was nothing heroic, just a simple act that didn't require proof or permission. As they waited for the elevator back down, the young woman looked at her carefully. "You're Evelyn Harris, right?" Evelyn nodded. "They told me about you. Side you took on the whole company." Evelyn gave a half-smile. "Not the whole company. Just the part that forgot who does the real work." The woman grinned, and for a moment, Evelyn felt the weight of generations in that single shared glance, one that said, "I see you. I know what it cost." Later that week, Evelyn met with the new board committee overseeing ethics and restructuring. She was now a permanent advisor unpaid by choice, so she couldn't be compromised. She presented her latest findings. Procurement from minority-owned vendors had increased by 32%. Retaliation reports had dropped. Leadership roles held by women and people of color had risen for the first time in a decade. Progress, she said simply, but not permanence. This system is designed to slip back unless someone holds the line. The chairman nodded, but Evelyn could see the familiar fatigue behind his eyes, the temptation to settle, to say this is enough. But it wasn't. Not yet. When the meeting ended, he followed her out. "You could run your own firm, Evelyn. People would fund it in a heartbeat. Why stay tied to this?" She paused at the door. "Because this is where the harm was done," she said. "And healing doesn't come from walking away. It comes from making sure the next woman doesn't have to bleed just to be heard." He didn't respond. But he didn't argue either. Evelyn spent that weekend out of the city at her grandmother's old house, the one with the crooked porch and the stubborn rose bush that refused to die, no matter how hard the frost hit. She walked through the old kitchen, the walls still lined with jars of dried herbs and folded linens. She found the wooden chair where her grandmother used to sit and read aloud from the paper, her voice full of fire even in old age. "Don't let them make you choose between truth and survival," her grandmother once said. "Live so you can do both." That line had guided Evelyn for years. It had cost her dearly. But it had also given her something few people ever reached: clarity. On Monday, she returned to the office and found a letter slipped under her door. No name, just handwriting. "When I joined Halberd 5 years ago, I thought I had to stay invisible to survive. I watched people like you get shut down, and I told myself I wasn't strong enough to fight. But you didn't disappear. You stood in the fire and made room for the rest of us. I'm still scared, but I'm not silent anymore." There was no signature. Evelyn didn't need one. She folded the note gently and placed it in the small drawer where she kept the hardest things: copies of legal threats, news clippings, hate mail. She kept them not to dwell, but to remember that for every act of courage there was always cost, but also always impact. The final piece of her reform plan went into effect that fall: a permanent public ledger, accessible to all employees, tracking diversity metrics, hiring trends, and ethical violations. It had no passwords, no buried footnotes. Anyone could see where the power went and who it served. It was met with immediate backlash. Executives from other companies called it reckless. Anonymous op-eds accused Halberd & Co. of caving to political agendas. Some investors pulled out. Others doubled down. Evelyn watched it all without blinking. She had built something that would outlast her position, her name, even her presence. Something structural. At the year-end all-hands meeting, the new CEO interim, but younger, less rehearsed, invited Evelyn to the stage. The invitation was unexpected. So was the standing ovation. She stood behind the mic and looked out at the hundreds of faces before her. "I'm not here to be celebrated," she said. "I'm here to remind you that the work isn't finished." The room quieted. "I know this company's history. I've lived its silence. I've carried its shadows. But I also know what's possible when people stop hiding behind titles and start leading with truth. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to keep showing up and refusing to disappear. She looked directly at Maya, now seated in the second row, wearing a badge with the title Director. The legacy of this company won't be measured by how much it earned. It'll be measured by who it finally saw, and who it finally made space for. That night, Evelyn walked home beneath a soft sky, city lights reflecting in the puddles of last week's rain. She passed the office towers without looking up. She no longer needed to. Justice didn't live in buildings. It lived in the people who refused to be broken. And she had become one of them. Not the hero they wrote about in articles. Not the symbol they cheered for once a year, but the architect of something lasting, something real, something that could no longer be erased.